Okay, guys, today we are going to continue with the notes. This one obviously is entitled Struggles for Change, but just again, keep in mind, and I know I've mentioned this a few times, but this is all still taking place during the 1960s. So, we covered JFK and LBJ, then we moved on to the civil rights movement, and now we're going to talk about the feminist movement and, basically the group of people of the 60s known as the hippies, which most of you have probably at least heard of. And just kind of, like I said before, keep in mind, this is all occurring at the same time. So this is all happening simultaneously. So we're talking about when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, the Bay of Pigs, the Kennedy assassination, MLK and Malcolm X and the civil rights, events, the marches and the protests and all that stuff, and then their assassinations. And then, like I said, also this rise of this demographic known as the hippies and their psychedelic movement. This was all occurring all at the same time. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we go over this stuff. So women's rights. So Betty Friedman was a significant individual in regards to the feminist movement. She wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique in 1963. And it said that, this book basically said something somewhat revolutionary. It said that women felt trapped by the comfortable concentration camps, as she called them, of domestic life, and that women sought to change their role in the workplace. Women made up 1/3 of the workforce in 1960 and received less pay. So essentially, keep in mind, after World War II in the 1950s, the role of the woman was predominantly that of a stay-at-home mom or a housewife. And so, after the war, women were expected to go back to the household and do what, women of that era were expected to do, which was take care of the house and cook dinner and take care of the kids and things of that nature while the men went to work. And then by the 1960s with, women like Betty Friedman, she said that a lot of women were not fulfilled in that role of being a housewife. And so she's saying women want to get out and, have careers and take more of a prominent role in society like men did. And, that's what this whole thing was all about. And so, again, that kind of spurred a movement of women taking a more prominent role in society. And, a big event like it says here, in 1960 was the invention of the birth control pill. And the reason that was so significant was because, oftentimes women would sort of get pregnant unexpectedly, and then that would sort of confine them to being housewives or stay-at-home moms. And so once the birth control pill was invented in 1960, women had more control over whether or not they were going to have kids. And then, if they were, in favor of having a career, outside of the house, they were more in control of that because now they had the birth control pill and they could control whether or not they were going to get pregnant. So, people don't really think about this much today, but when the birth control pill was invented, it was like a huge deal because of that reason. And, a lot of women felt like they had more control over their destiny. So Kennedy responds, Equal Pay Act, women, this basically was a law that said that women were to receive equal pay, but it did not extend into agriculture, professional, or service industries. Kennedy appointed Eleanor Roosevelt. Keep in mind, Eleanor Roosevelt was the widow of FDR. So you can see in this picture, she's pretty old by this point, but she had been a prominent leader for women. And it says here he promoted her to head the President's Commission on the Status of Women. Title VII stated that the government would provide assistance to prevent discrimination of women in the workforce. So again, you're seeing government legislation being enacted to, basically try to ensure that women are being treated fairly and equally. Heightened activism. So the National Organization for Women, another acronym, NOW, was formed in June of 1966, and it was a women's rights group who tried to influence elected officials to ensure equality for women. So again, you're seeing, these activist groups created in order to promote, fair treatment of women, essentially. Like it says here, a new generation, 1960s, female social activists began to spread women's equality. Gloria Steinem was another significant individual. She was involved in civil rights and political activism and looked at the status of American interests. The National Women's Political Caucus encouraged women to run for politics. So again, now you're seeing more of a movement towards getting women active in the political process, getting women elected into political office. And again, this was something that was just predominantly male-dominated activity, was like, serving in political office before this time period. So this is just a picture of, so you can see here, it says Freedom Trash Can. And this is actually women lighting their bras on fire and throwing them away. And this was an act of civil disobedience, basically, for women, symbolizing that they're not going to be restricted any longer in society. And just a couple pictures here. I don't know if any of you recognize these women. You may recognize one or two of them, but these are their high school photos. But as you can see here, the one on the bottom was Kamala Harris, and then we have Hillary Clinton, and the one on the right is actually Sarah Palin, who she was a pretty big political figure, early 2000s. If you were a little older, you would probably recognize her, but you probably recognize the other two. So it's kind of interesting to see how their looks change throughout the years and stuff like that. Hillary Clinton was like a hippie. So, but yeah, again, just kind of interesting there. So a movement gains momentum. So like it says here, mixed success. The Education Amendment Act outlawed sexual discrimination in the workplace of higher education. Roe versus Wade was a huge landmark Supreme Court case that gave women and the doctor, not the state or the government, the right to choose whether or not to have a child. So Roe versus Wade dealt with the issue of abortion. Obviously, you guys know that's still a hot topic of debate today. Opposition, the Equal Rights Amendment failed to pass in Congress. And like it says here underneath that, Phyllis Schlafly was a conservative who was happy that the amendment died, because she said happiness resulted from being a wife and mother and working with her husband to reach their goals as a family. So, one thing we have to remember is there's always two sides to every issue. And so when we talk about the feminist movement and women's empowerment, it's not like all women wanted to have careers or all women wanted to leave the household. And that's what this is all about, is this Phyllis Schlafly lady. She was saying that's not true. Women don't feel trapped. Women actually feel fulfilled when they're married and have kids and, kind of help maintain the household and things of that nature. So again, there were two sides of this issue. It's not like all women were on one side or the other. And, that's probably still the case today. Of course there's women who want to go out and have careers and, pursue success and things like that in the workplace. But there's also women who are happy being stay-at-home moms and mothers and, that just want to fulfill that role as well. So I think the important thing to note here is that women should have the opportunity to kind of do what they want, right? It's not like they have to do one thing or the other. It's more of women should have the choice and the opportunity to live the life that they want. So the Chicano movement, a model stirring of protests, so a model for the movement of Mexican Americans. 4 million Mexican Americans in the U.S. were among the poorest at this time. Cesar Chavez was the leader of the National Farm Workers Association, and he organized migrant workers into a collective organization so that they could bargain for better pay, better rights and things like that, workers' rights. He organized a series of strikes and boycotts in Delano, California. Filipino and Mexican workers went on strike on September 16, 1965, demanding better, treatment and pay. The NFWA formed the United Farm Workers, inspired many African Americans to join their cause in the civil rights movement. So again, you're just seeing a lot of political activism here in regards to better treatment. Student action. So students took action in Los Angeles, California. Mexican Americans resent poor quality of their schools. The Brown Berets were inspired by the Black Panthers. They were an activist organization of students who were basically created in response to brutality against Mexican Americans. In East Los Angeles, there were a series of school walkouts which brought attention to Mexican American equality, because the quality of those schools were not seen as, basically as good as they felt they should be. So just a series of protests here. American Indian activism. Many American Indians were affected by poverty during the 60s and 70s and wanted to change American society. There was an event that occurred called the Alcatraz occupation, and you guys probably remember, I think we talked about Alcatraz at the beginning of the year. It was a prison that was located in San Francisco Bay. It had since been shut down because it was too expensive to operate. But like it says here, the Red Power movement activists called the Indians of all tribes gathered on an island, which was Alcatraz, and basically they were protesting the mistreatment of American Indians. Like it says here, American Indians offered to buy the land from the federal government, but federal authorities removed the protesters from the island instead. So there you see a picture of Alcatraz. And like I said, it's no longer an active prison, but it was occupied by this activist group, just basically as a protest to their, the way that they felt they were being treated. They were being mistreated, and they were demanding better treatment and more assistance from the government. So, Wounded Knee, the American Indian Movement, or AIM, was a major force behind the Red Power movement. It called for the renewal of American Indian culture and recognition of American Indian rights. After intense debate, the government agreed to consider AIM's grievances. And again, more pictures here of the protests that were occurring. Obviously, they're still occurring. So a cultural revolution in 1968 in America. 1968 was seen as a really big year in terms of just events occurring here in the U.S. Come on, people now. So there was a generation gap. And what a generation gap is basically, let me just read through this first bullet. So Cold War fears, massive civil rights protests, and the Vietnam War led many young Americans to question the values of American society. So a lot of the youth of this time, the teenagers, were starting to question the values of their parents. And that would lead to a lot of protests and, again, a lot more activism during this time period. And so, like it says here, the generation gap was between the baby boomers and the elders that grew in the 1960s. So essentially, baby boomers were the teenagers of this era. And, we talked about that. After World War II, there was a large number of babies being born, and they're now becoming teenagers. And so the divide between them and their parents was starting to grow. Like, there was a difference between the way that their parents were thinking and the way that they were thinking. That's known as the generation gap. They didn't really understand each other very well. And I know this still happens today, right? Like, sometimes you and your parents might not quite see eye to eye. It's pretty common. Like it says here, Mario Savio was a leader of the student activist protests, and he compared universities to machines and basically encouraged students to, fight the machine and stand up for what they thought was right. By 1965, protests took place on college campuses nationwide for various reasons that we're going to talk about. So you can see here a lot of student activism, people getting arrested. So the counterculture. So the counterculture is basically referring to the hippies. Think about it. Culture is what makes a society what it is. It's all the characteristics, from music to, the way that people dress, to their religion, to their language. That's a culture. And so the counterculture was going against the social norms, right? And that's basically the hippies, right? And this guy, Timothy Leary, he encouraged young people to turn on, tune in, and drop out of this, normal society. And this became known as the counterculture, which basically promoted an alternate lifestyle. And this is where the hippies come from. Hippies, I believe, I know that they were descendants of the Beats. The Beats, I mentioned them briefly when we talked about the 1950s, and they were sort of like the rebels of that era, and then eventually that kind of evolved into the hippies, which was short for hipsters. They rejected materialism and the work ethic of past generations in favor of simplicity. So they basically rejected the lifestyle of their parents. There was a large dropout rate of high school students, especially in San Francisco, which was kind of like the epicenter of the movement. Timothy Leary, the guy in the picture here, was a Harvard University instructor or professor who became LSD or acid's leading supporter. Many hippies searched for new physical experiences by experimenting with drugs. So the psychedelic drugs of the era were a big part of the counterculture. So kids were doing all sorts of psychedelic drugs like LSD, and this was affecting their nonconformist activities and their rejection of the values of their parents. And there was actually something called the Harvard Psilocybin Project. And essentially what this is a book about it, but these professors at Harvard were given psychedelic drugs by the government to conduct experiments. And, like I mentioned, this Timothy Leary guy, he kind of was one of the leaders of this experimentation process. And he eventually starts to kind of reject, the social norms of that era. And, again, he was encouraging young people to kind of like also reject the values of their parents. He gets arrested for, I think, marijuana possession. The fashion of the hippies, like it says here, was a casual, colorful style of dress, clothes with bright colors, tie-dye. You guys have seen all this kind of stuff. And this is kind of, what young people were doing at the time. Growing their hair long. That again was a rejection of the social norms. Men had before this had short hair, things of that nature. And this really concerned the parents of the era because this is obviously a more recent photo of some old school hippies, but the parents were really afraid for the young people because they thought this is going to be the downfall of society. And so the downfall of psychedelic drugs, like it says here, experimentation came at a high price. Drug abuse was at an all-time high in the U.S. amongst young people, and reported cases of drug addiction and sexually transmitted diseases grew. Because also along with this hippie culture came this message of free love, quote-unquote free love. And as people were having free love, they were also spreading a lot of STDs. This guy, Charles Manson, he was a cult leader. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He's pretty famous. But he and his followers carried out a series of murders. And this, basically is what most historians would agree upon was the end of the hippie era. Because, as these murders occurred of this cult of hippies, it made people more fearful of this psychedelic drug hippie movement. And so Manson brainwashed his followers. He was using LSD and I think some other drugs. He was giving his followers drugs, and he would kind of like, preach to them and stuff like that when they were under the influence. And like it says here, he gave orders to slaughter Sharon Tate, among others. And this was like a huge news story at the time. It was all over TV and the trials and things like that. And we may watch a documentary on this. There are a number of documentaries on it, and it's, if you're into like crime shows and stuff like that, it's kind of an interesting case. But these were members of his cult. They all just lived together basically on a ranch. It was a former movie set where they used to film westerns, but they look like a happy group of people, but it turns out they had murdered this poor girl here. She was an actress, Sharon Tate, and this was her husband, Roman Polanski. He was a movie director. He still is a movie director. He's still alive, but the whole thing is just really weird. I mean, again, you guys know that I do like conspiracies, and there's a whole conspiracy behind this whole thing. But one of the really odd things is, and I did throw a couple slides in here, but so she was married to this guy, Roman Polanski. She was pregnant at the time of her murder, which makes it even more tragic. But the weird thing about it is these murders occurred in 1969. But in 1968, Roman Polanski produced a movie called Rosemary's Baby. And you guys probably have never heard of this, but I've never seen it, but it was a pretty big movie at the time. And the movie was about this girl who was pregnant with Satan's baby. Yes. So the movie was about this girl, and she got pregnant. She was having Satan's child, and yeah, sounds pretty creepy and all that kind of stuff. And keep in mind, this is when like The Exorcist came out, and there were a lot of these like really scary horror movies coming out. But this movie, again, produced by this guy, came out in 1968, and then his wife and his unborn child are murdered viciously by this cult of what some people thought were Satanists. I mean, again, it's very complicated. I don't want to get into all the details right now, but this was one of the murderers. So most of those murderers are still alive. I'm trying to think. I think they're all still in prison. Charles Manson just died a couple years ago. But, it's just weird how, like I said, the coincidence of that movie coming out in 68 and then those murders occurring in 69. And this happens sometimes. And this was actually another interesting story that I had heard recently, but it was this movie came out in 2022. It's called White Noise. And it was basically about a train crash that spilled chemicals into the environment, so on and so forth. And I think it was in Ohio or something like that. And then in 2023, there was actually like the same exact thing that was the storyline of this movie in 2022. Like the same exact thing happened in East Palestine in the U.S., which was a train crash. It spilled a bunch of chemicals into the water and stuff like that. So it's just weird how sometimes, like, you know, fiction emulates like real events, you know. So, and one thing I threw in here as well, it was happening around the same time, was the Son of Sam murders. I don't know if you ever heard of this, but it was 1977. This guy, you know, I'm trying to think of his name. Can't remember his name, but it escapes me right now, but I'll think of it. But he killed 6 people in New York City and wounded 7, and he was just kind of a, you know, again, it was like a random series of murders, and, you know, it paralyzed New York City for like an entire summer because people were so scared that this guy was going to go out and, you know, he was just like randomly shooting people in New York City, and then they finally caught him. And again, I mean, there's like a whole bunch of conspiracy stuff around this, but basically the initial story that he said, I think his name was Berkowitz. That's his name, Berkowitz. But the story was that he said his neighbor's dog was like telling him to kill people. And so again, there's all sorts of cult, satanic theories that surround this story. But again, this was another huge story at the time. And again, this guy's still alive too. I think he has become a born-again Christian. But just some crazy stuff going on. So there's Charles Manson. Yeah, he carved an X in his head. I think he later turned that into a swastika.
The man who most terrorized Hollywood.
People look at you today, 20 years later, and they still have no idea what you're about. Tell me in a sentence who you are.
Nobody. Bundy's a rumpkin. Bundy's a poop butt. Bundy's his mama's boy. Bundy's out there trying to prove something to his own manhood. That's got nothing to do with me. I don't roll around with people like that. I stand with people that can stand with themselves.
What do you think about what he said about pornography?
Pornography? I've been looking at it all my life, and it hasn't affected me anything. Who do you think I am, girl? If you could pick all the words of the vocabulary that your mother told you, who do you think I am? And this is only a couple hours. Can you imagine what it would be like a couple days with me? I live 100 years a day.
Do you feel blame? Are you mad? Do you feel like Wolf's Bob right Francis? Get Francis. Well, God, I guess you're my best friend, being I invented you.
You believe in God, Charles?
Sure, I believe in myself. Why wouldn't I? Which one?
Are you Jesus Christ?
Which Jesus? There's all kinds of Jesuses. There's a black Jesus down in Florida. He's having a good time. There's a Mexican Jesus in Mexico. I mean, there's all kinds of there's a Jewish Jesus. I mean, Jesus, you know. There's all kinds of Jesus coming back everywhere. And nothing can stop it. It's a consciousness that lives in your mind.
Music is my soul. Music's the way I express. It's my religion. It's my religion.
You've also said sex is religion.
Yeah, sex is a reflection. Everything's a reflection of this. When you reflect that, you reflect music. I reflect it in music. That's me.
Manson is sort of a showman, like when he tried to, as he puts it, take me to a higher level. Or when I again asked him to define his unique charm. What do you think it is about you that makes people want to be a part of whatever it is you're a part of?
I'm brand new. Everything I do is always brand new. I'm on the premise of reality. I walk a real road. I'm a real person inside. I'm not a phony. I don't put on no airs. I say what I think. You see what I'm saying?
Aren't you putting on an air now? Aren't you putting on an act for me?
When you look it back, see if it's an air. See if where you get it. And someone sees it and goes by and they say, hey, how you doing? I say, pretty good. How you be?
Changing American society, the rise of the counterculture reflected the doubts that many citizens, many of the youth, held about the direction of American society. Americans began questioning a variety of issues from religion to the arts. And in 1969, Western religion had lost its influence over a lot of young people in America. So Western religion meaning predominantly Christianity, that was the predominant religion here. And because these young people, a lot of young people were kind of trying to, reject the beliefs of their parents, that also included religion. And so you start to see Eastern religions being introduced to the U.S. And keep in mind, this is back in the 60s. So, there's no internet for another couple of decades. And even just getting a hold of books and things like that were actually really tough. There were no Barnes and Nobles. There were no, Amazon or where you could get any book you want. So this guy, Alan Watts, if you go on YouTube and search him, he's got tons of videos, but he released 10,000 radio broadcasts during this time period. And like it says here, he brought Eastern religions to the Western world, meaning Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism. And, I've listened to him quite a bit, actually, because he's a very good speaker. He was a former minister, and then he kind of started getting into the Eastern religions. And, but again, he's kind of credited with bringing, a different view on religion simultaneously with this rejection of American culture that influenced a lot of young people. And you can see here, this is actually the Beatles, and they actually had a mentor who was a Hindu, and so they were implementing this into their music, and obviously a lot of their fans were kind of getting into the Eastern religions because of that. And this guy's name is Allen Ginsberg, and he was actually from the beatnik era that I'd mentioned before, and then he kind of moved into the hippie counterculture, and he was also preaching a lot of, I believe he was a Buddhist and a Hindu, so he was bringing a lot of these ideas into the Western world as well and influencing young people. So, the music of this era was a big part of the culture as well. So sounds of the 60s, rock music, 1950s rock and roll reflected social change in America, and by 1964, the British invasion had occurred, and this is basically when a lot of bands from England or Britain came to the U.S. And like it says here, the introduction of British bands to American audiences, the Beatles, Rolling Stones, there's a ton of them, but the electric guitar inspired people to innovate new music. So there was a whole new sound that came in with this era. And I said, are the Beatles the biggest band of all time? They're definitely up there. But again, they had longer hair. And I remember my dad saying that, my dad was like a teenager around this time, and he wasn't a hippie, I don't think, but not all young people were hippies. Again, it was just like a certain demographic. But I remember my dad saying that his dad, so my grandfather, was very angry about the long hair, and he just he'd see him on TV and he'd get really mad about their hair being long and stuff like that. So, but there is a conspiracy with the Beatles as well, which is Paul McCartney was in a bad car accident, and you can see here the car is pretty banged up, but the conspiracy is that they replaced Paul McCartney because they didn't want to lose all their fans and all that money, so they replaced him with a lookalike. And this is the guy who was his lookalike. That's not him. But basically people are saying he was killed in this crash, and then they brought in this other guy, and he just kind of picked up where they left off. And you can see this is one of their famous album covers, and Paul's not wearing any shoes, and people are saying there's a bunch of conspiracy theorists about this, that's representing that it's not really him and things like that. So again, you can look into this if you're interested in it. So this is Black Sabbath. Just a lot of different bands came out of this era. Folks reborn. Folk artists such as Bob Dylan wrote lyrics that sent a political message to listeners. So again, you're starting to hear a lot of political music coming out of this era because of the Vietnam conflict. And so, obviously we're going to take a look at Vietnam here in the near future, but it was a lot of anti-war music by a lot of these artists. So Bob Dylan linked folk music and rock music in 1965. There's Bob Dylan. This is Creedence Clearwater Revival. This is, I believe that's the Grateful Dead. They were big at this time. The Doors. So some of you guys probably hear some of this music still. Motown and soul got big at the time. Motown Records was in Detroit. It helped bring African Americans back into the forefront of popular music, perhaps the most dynamics. James Brown was big, rhythm and blues, known as soul. He was the godfather of soul. Aretha Franklin was the queen of soul. She sang Respect. So another huge hit at that time. Woodstock, most of you probably heard of this. In August 1969, some 400,000 young people went to upstate New York for a 3-day festival. Woodstock was more than a rock concert. It was a celebration of an era that marked the high point of the counterculture, and it was shortly after this. So this is 1969. This was right around the time of the Manson murders, and this is sort of when this whole hippie movement started to kind of die down. And by the 1970s, the whole hippie thing was kind of over. But, it was basically like a huge concert, and you can see all the mud and stuff like that. There is a conspiracy that the government was flying over with airplanes trying to make it rain so that, basically rain out the concert. And before you guys start to kind of laugh about that, they were actually doing the same thing in Vietnam at the time. So planes were flying over and spraying stuff into the atmosphere to make it rain because they were trying to flood out the enemy. So they did have that capability. But obviously, with that large number of people coming to upstate New York, there were a lot of logistics that, those small towns and things like of that area, they weren't equipped for that many people, So there was a lot of this type of stuff: traffic jams, food issues, shelter issues, restroom issues. I mean, it was just I don't know if they were quite ready for that large number of people to go up there and have this huge concert. But regardless, they did it. So, just some of the artists of that time. And there was another conspiracy here. Like it says, a large number of the counterculture bands and musicians had fathers who were high-ranking military officials. And this guy, David McGowan, actually wrote a book about it. I've never read it. I actually kind of want to. But he basically points out all these big stars of that era, including Jim Morrison, who was the lead singer of The Doors. His dad was an admiral who actually was involved in the opening battle of Vietnam. His dad was the admiral of that ship. And so this guy wrote a book about, kind of drawing connections between these artists and their dads who were high-ranking military officials. And then, suddenly and mysteriously, this guy died. So I think he was in his 40s. I think they said he had cancer or something like that, but I don't know. Anyways, a lot of people turned out for this. Like I said, 400,000 people. So it was just basically, any of you have been up into upstate New York, there's not much up there. So it's basically just farms and stuff like that. So pretty crazy. And just pictures from Woodstock. There's Jimi Hendrix. He played the national anthem famously. Probably the greatest guitar player of all time, arguably. I mean, there's a lot of good guitar players, but he's definitely up there. And that about does it.